Everyone who considers themselves a nerd has surely imagined having a superpower to save the world and live great adventures. But most don't realize that not every power is advantageous. There are some characters whose powers are more curses than blessings, powers that cause real afflictions when activated, and those are the ones we'll see in today's video. Starting with the Hulk. Some details of Bruce Banner's transformation into the Hulk often go unnoticed, and the pain he feels in the process is one of them. Once, due to Loki's interference, Spider-Man and Bruce swapped powers, and the Webhead experienced what it's like to have the Hulk. First, he felt the monster under his skin and knew exactly when the transformation would happen. His muscles swell, his bones expand, his teeth are pushed outward, and so on. And Bruce feels this entire process with every transformation. In the Immortal Hulk comic, it was shown that the Hulk doesn't even need to transform gradually. He can simply burst out from within Bruce, tearing his body apart from the inside out. This alone already seems extremely painful, but it's gotten much worse lately since the Hulk is furious with Banner. The scientist tried to take control of the Green Giant and subjected him to countless unnecessary tortures to use his strength, turning his body into a vessel. When this phase passed, the Hulk not only stopped cooperating with Bruce, but now makes a point of making the transformation as painful as possible. Visually, it's even hard to watch some scenes. Now imagine Bruce suffering more and more every time he needs to fight for his life. Not to mention that he has super regeneration, but he's not immune to pain, and blows like piercing his head or tearing his stomach must hurt a lot too. But continuing, Wolverine being on this list is somewhat obvious, as even in the movies, he has explained that it hurts when his claws come out. Wolverine's skeleton includes 6 retractable bone claws, each 30 centimeters long, 3 in each arm, housed beneath the skin and muscles of his forearms. This applies to him, his children, and rivals with similar powers, but I'll mention Wolverine because he was the first. The bone claws are naturally sharp and tougher than normal human bone, but they became extremely sharper after being infused with adamantium. Every time he releases his claws, the character has to tear through the flesh between his fingers for them to come out. Keep in mind that having his hands straight isn't necessary for the claws to emerge. If they're bent, the claws will come out through his wrists, which must be even more painful. Wolverine basically can only use his power thanks to his healing factor, so much so that when he temporarily lost this ability, he stopped using his claws and relied more on armor. Now, Marrow is a character who greatly resembles Wolverine even in her powers, but on a much larger scale. As a child, Sarah was one of the Morlocks living underground and was saved by Gambit during the massacre that struck their community. Years later, most of the surviving Morlocks were apparently killed by Mikhail Rasputin, though they were actually taken to another dimension. There, Rasputin had established a citadel for himself at the top of a hill, following a social Darwinist philosophy of survival of the fittest. If someone managed to reach the top of the hill, they were considered fit and worthy of joining the Gene Nation. When her powers fully manifested, Sarah was forced to climb the hill, becoming more feral and killing her opponents to survive. When she reached the top, she became eligible to join the elite combat team, the Gene Nation, which eventually turned into a terrorist group with the mission of punishing humans for their hatred of mutants. But as I mentioned, the character is very similar to Wolverine, as her mutation also involves her bones. She has the ability to control the growth, shape, and strength of her skeletal structure. Her body generates bone protrusions that she can remove and wield as weapons, even using them as a form of protective shield or armor, covering herself with them. And despite having a healing factor, she feels not only the pain of her skin tearing with the bones, but also the pain of having to rip them out. Something that goes far beyond Wolverine's experience. But despite those last ones being quite famous, this one really isn't. Angelo Unushoni, also known as Unis, is an extremely powerful character, and that's exactly why he's in this video. He was a mutant whose powers only emerged during adolescence, and he first used them as a school bully and later as a petty criminal. At some point after immigrating to America, Unushoni legally changed his name to Gunther Bane. He used his abilities to launch a career as a flamboyant, invincible, costumed wrestler known by the stage name Unus the Untouchable. And this name isn't random. His mutant powers allow him to generate an invisible psionic field around himself. He can mentally control the field, making it as thick or thin as he wishes, capable of deflecting and stopping objects or projectiles, and also using it to move or push people or things. Initially, the limits of this field weren't established, but it was certainly an extremely powerful force field, as it withstood blows from an enraged Hulk. After M-Day, when Scarlet Witch depowered most mutants, he used the Inhumans' Terrigen Mists to try to regain his powers. It worked, but they returned far too strong and uncontrollable, his powers becoming so advanced that his shield began blocking radio waves, sound waves, light waves, and other things. One of those other things was oxygen, leaving Unus unable to breathe, and as a result, he ended up dying. Moving forward with the list, Paige Guthrie is the sister of a relatively famous X-Men member, Cannonball, and after his powers manifested, she did everything she could to find out if she was also a mutant. Venting her frustration after countless failures, Paige finally discovered that her power was to shed her skin and eventually join the mutant team. You could see she had a tremendous rivalry with her brother, as her focus was always on becoming a better member than him. Anyway, still talking about her powers, Husk has the mutant ability to shed her outer layer of skin to reveal a new state or form underneath. Her power can cause random changes if she activates it without thinking, but by focusing on specific chemical or elemental formulas, she can control the nature of her transformation. She can become any solid she has studied and can mimic metal, diamond, granite, wood, rubber, and even glass. She can maintain a form for about an hour before needing to return to her original form, but the problem with all this is that her powers don't grant immunity to pain. Even though it's easier for her to rip off her own skin, it's still extremely painful to the point of leaving her psychologically unstable, especially when using her powers repeatedly. And wrapping up with the mutants, Nezhno Abedemi is the son of a Wakandan woman and a Russian man, and he was persecuted and rejected for almost his entire life, including by his mother. This was because his father was an outsider, something that Wakandans culturally reject, and it was from him that Nezhno inherited his X gene. When his mutant powers manifested, Storm, the Queen of Wakanda, advised her husband T'Challa to send Nezhno to the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning to learn to control them. This was incredibly fortunate for the character, as, thanks to his mother's rejection, he lived in the Wakandan court, and Storm quickly identified that he was a mutant. This may have saved his life because the consequences of the abuse he suffered as a child led him to develop psychological trauma, which caused him severe pain and seizures. These seizures worsened as he used his powers, which involved the ability to increase his body's muscle mass, allowing him to drastically grow in size and strength almost instantly. To alleviate his condition, Nezhno's entire body was covered with vibranium tattoos to prevent him from overexerting himself and dying from his own power. These tattoos were adapted from molten raw vibranium using an ancient Wakandan technique developed to relieve seizures and tremors. Normally, the tattoos were temporary, but the character's mutation caused the vibranium to bond with his flesh down to the muscle, becoming essential for him to stay alive. Curiously, there was a time in the comics when all vibranium became a common, practically useless metal, but the consequences of this change for Nezhno were never shown. But still talking about these characters who suffer from powers related to their own body and skin, we have Ghost Rider. Here I could talk about all of them, but the one who really complains the most about it is Johnny Blaze. The character literally catches fire from the inside out and remains in flames while transformed. Of course, after the transformation is complete, he no longer feels any pain, but until that point, the pain is relentless. Rogue once absorbed Johnny Blaze's spirit of vengeance and literally begged him to take it back because of the suffering of being in that form. There are comics that even show the spirit of vengeance literally piercing Blaze's chest, tearing through living flesh before taking control control. Not to mention that in the early stages of the curse, the host often loses control and becomes unconscious during the transformation, indicating that the experience is traumatic and overwhelming. Moving now to the Hellboy universe, Liz Sherman was born in Kansas and was an ordinary girl until her pyrokinetic abilities began to become evident on her 11th birthday. She was raised in a strict Catholic family and felt that the fires were a result of her sins. For a short period, she managed to keep them under control through a combination of prayer and sheer willpower. However, in July 1973, at age 11, she lost control again. The eruption destroyed an entire city block, and among the 32 fatalities, took the lives of her parents, brother, and pet dog. Liz's last uncontrolled manifestation occurred on July 4th, 1984, and the eruption killed her friends and family and even destroyed an entire city block. Obviously, all of this left the character extremely traumatized, and she was taken in by the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, where she learned to control her powers to a certain extent. Besides her powers being in a way exhausting to her body, the psychological damage she suffers is surreal. She's mentioned finding the use of her powers addictive, but constant use can lead her to lose herself in the flames, which would make her even more destructive. This would create a virtually infinite snowball effect where using her powers fuels the addiction, generates more trauma, which increases her lack of control and makes her use her powers again. Returning to more well-known comics, Raven is included in this video for a very different reason than the other characters already mentioned. She's here because of the damage related to her emotional powers. As everyone knows, Raven is one of the most powerful characters in comics and one of the most skilled sorceresses in DC. Not only is she the daughter of one of the most powerful interdimensional demons ever, but she's also a direct relative of the Great Darkness, one of the publisher's greatest entities. So, along with her extremely extensive array of powers, she also has empathy, the ability to feel and manipulate the emotions of others. It might seem like a somewhat trivial power, and if not used correctly, it can indeed be trivial. But she can use this power to absorb another person's mental damage. So if someone suffers a very strong psychic attack, she can simply nullify that damage. The problem is that this damage transfers directly to her, and often the damage she takes from using her powers manifests in her as physical damage, which allows me to include Raven in today's video. To be fair, I haven't found many references or images of this happening in recent comics, so it's possible that the character no longer has this disadvantage when using her powers. But I still believe it's worth mentioning her, as it's a very interesting way to use this power, reminding me a lot of Kuma in One Piece. Finally, a character most of you probably wouldn't expect in a video like this is Black Cat. After all, most of the time, Black Cat doesn't have superpowers, but it has happened, and it's a pretty interesting power. She has the ability to cause bad luck, which was imbued by scientists working for the Kingpin through a deal made with him. This power was later removed by Doctor Strange, and she sought out a supervillain scientist to regain them. He grafted cybernetic enhancements into Felicia's body, a quantum probability pulsar which causes bad luck to other people. This power allows her to subliminally affect probability fields, causing unlikely, though not impossible, bad luck events to enemies within her line of sight. So it's kind of like Domino's power, but in reverse, where her enemies become useless around her because they're extremely unlucky. The problem is that it doesn't always work. Her powers can backfire on her, especially if she fights other probability manipulators. So I included her here more as an honorable mention, since while she can be invincible, she might slip off a building and fall while fleeing from Spider-Man. And it's exactly this character who wraps up today's video. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Leave a like down below and subscribe to help the channel keep growing. Send it to that friend of yours who doesn't know anything about comics. Comment below which of these powers you think is the worst. Thanks, and see you next time.